Hey Spartans, Josh here. Just wanted to give you a heads up coming into these episodes in the month of May. Just like last year, we're doing a full dedication to the month of May to what nationally they call Mental Health Awareness Month. We're trying to change it into Brain Health Awareness Month. That being said, these episodes will be sensitive in nature. I do want you to lean in though. Last year I asked you if you were in a dark spot, potentially not to listen or tune out. I'm actually going to ask the opposite this time, that you lean in. I am here for you. If you need to talk, please shoot me a DM. If you're struggling right now, if you're in a dark spot, I want you to know that I am here at any time. And these messages, these stories will help. They are going to give you seeds of hope this month. And for those of you doing well, I encourage you to donate this month, time or money or treasures of your choosing to this national crisis. That being said, enjoy these wonderful episodes with some amazing human beings that have truly inspiring stories. I want to really dig in on how this novice, this rookie at mindfulness about meditation can get into this.
We're giving the mind a job to do. Mindfulness is really concerned with having attention be where we want it to be, in particular in the present moment. People get the idea that they're supposed to stop their minds from wandering. They're supposed to blank their minds. That is impossible to do. Can I notice that, choose to bring my attention back to where I want it to be? And that's a skill we can train. So we want to be aware of experience as it's happening without being swept into the storm. So by training to pay attention to anchors, then we develop this meta-awareness to know what's happening as it's happening, and that stability naturally starts to emerge. We cannot let how we feel in the moment to get in the way of us allowing to perform the best we can in that moment. Maybe your absolute best in that moment is 85%. Let's go give 85%, man. Yeah. And what we shouldn't do is be in that 85% thinking about like, oh, I wish I had this other 15%. What can I do to get it, right? That's just like distracting from what we can be bringing to that moment. Being consistent is hard. What am I doing to train my mind to be able to consistently show up and perform in those moments? So when it's go time, we got to be able to go.
This is Sparta!
Welcome back to Spartan Leadership. I'm your host, Josh Kosnick, and we got a special episode today because we got someone live in the studio. My friend Chad McGehee is here, and this is going to be a fun one for all of you. So we are going to be proactive on mental conditioning and brain health today. And so we're excited to have this conversation. For those of you that have been longtime listeners, I used to have a podcast called Inspire People, Impact Lives, which for those of you that see any of my sign-offs, it says Inspire and Impact Josh every time I sign off a piece of content, because that is the mission. And Chad was a guest about, 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago now, yeah.
So, which is crazy to think about that was 4 years ago. Now here we are. Chad, for those of you who don't know or didn't listen to that back then, because I know we got a lot of new listeners and growing very rapidly, is the director of meditation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I asked him this the other day because I was curious, being 4 years later, if he was still the only full-time faculty at any university that held that position. And that's still accurate, right?
It's still the case. It's a kind of first of its kind position where we're kind of focused on what do we know about training and researching the mind using this discipline of meditation training. So we're still at the front edge at UW.
That's awesome. So he's also a husband and father, passionate brain health advocate. So excited to have him today. And we're just going to hop right in and have some great dialogue. And hopefully you all are impacted by this. In fact, I don't even have to hope. I know you are. This is going to be a great conversation. So for those that didn't get to listen, which is going to be a lot, take us a little bit back, the new chapter in your life based on, well, I guess it's not a new chapter. You've been in this role for how many years now?
So I've been full-time in the role about 4 years, been working professionally in the space of meditation about 10, 12 years.
Awesome. All right. So how did you get into this role? What was the journey from Chad going to college, and some people got to hear this a long time ago, but I want to refresher. Like Chad going to college, Chad becoming a professional, obviously husband and father along the way, and then growing into this now new role and earning that at a very prestigious university.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't a straight line, that's for sure.
Oh, really? It's not just a straight line out?
And in some ways, Josh, like it wasn't the plan either, right? Like it just kind of unfolded, a series of events over time and started to kind of come together. So this is, my story began to be transparent out of difficulty, out of suffering. And it was the end of my high school career and my father unexpectedly passed away. So just massive suffering, right?
That's a tough time at that age.
Yeah, kind of that transition, right? How am I going to go out into the world, right? Without this anchor, this guide to support me in it. So as you can imagine, that put me on a path, right? Set me on a journey of like, how do I navigate the world with this new reality, particularly with the suffering, with the challenge. And I remember being in my parents' backyard and having this sense of I could run from this, I could hide from this, I could bury myself away from this, or I could turn toward it. I could find a way to go through it. And I can still feel it right now in this moment. And in that moment too, something quivered and said, you have to do that. You have to find a way to go through it. So that put me on the path to figure out how to do it. And ultimately it was mindfulness and meditation that gave me the skills, the frameworks to be able to do it. Never thought I'd teach anybody anything about this stuff. Thought it would just be for me as Chad, a guy living his life. But I felt like I was sitting on something really valuable, sitting on a gold mine. My first career, public school teacher. So I started to share with kids, share with stressed out colleagues. They benefited. And then that kind of turned me on to that second phase of my career. How do you effectively teach this stuff in other populations? I had an opportunity to join a research group then at UW-Madison called the Center for Healthy Minds, which happens to be kind of the world leading research group investigating mindfulness and meditation with rigorous neuroscientific methods. So for me, man, that was like I'm throwing the baseball in the backyard and the New York Yankees called and said, you want a job in the starting five, right? It was just an incredible opportunity. So there I got to work with world-class scientists to measure the impacts of this training. We did it in law enforcement, corporate, healthcare, education, and then athletics. So the athletic story has a kind of a journey of its own. So that came to be, I was a college soccer player. So I always saw how this stuff could show up in sport environments. But have this orientation of don't teach until you're asked to teach. When people are interested and ready, that's when effective teaching happens. So there's a guy who played football here at Wisconsin, then played in the NFL. Chris Borland is his name, and I know you know Chris. Yep. So Chris, after he retired from the league, wanted to do something to benefit guys who played the game. Long story short, we created this 8-week mindfulness-based training for 17 retired NFL guys, and we didn't know what would happen. They think it's a bunch of hippy-dippy, woo-woo, what are we talking about with meditation? That's not what they found. They found it rigorous. They found it beneficial. They were using it in their own lives. And some of those guys were still on staff at Wisconsin, including head strength coach for football at the time, including Chris McIntosh, who's now the athletic director, had a different role, 7 or 8 years ago when we did this pilot. And they invited me in to come start to share with student athletes, with staff, with coaches, because they thought they could benefit. And ultimately we saw there was a there. So then they created the position that I have of director of meditation training, which still has this kind of dual role of training and research. So I have kind of a faculty-like appointment so we can continue to publish on what we're finding.
Well, that's really cool. We'll jump a little bit around. Yeah. I want to go back to, what was the very first meditation you did and what was that like?
That's a great question.
Because you go through that period of loss and you choose to walk through it instead of drown your sorrows in booze or run away from it and try and bury it. Yeah. You chose to go through it. But I think that a lot of, I think a lot of men, especially us gruff men, football players, like my ex-football player like myself, are like, that is woo-woo. I can't sit still, or I'm ADD as well. So like, sure. I can't sit still and just be in my own thoughts. So like, what was that first experience like for you? Did it grab you right away or were you like?
No, I think part of what grabbed me right away is that it was hard and I enjoyed the difficulty of it, right? Because I agree, like being still with our own experience, with our own thoughts, with our own emotions can be really hard, can be really challenging. And I remember one of the things that hit me right away was even kind of the way we understand this word compassion, to build off of like the kind of like gruff, like how are we doing this, in like traditional masculinity. The word compassion at its root comes from Latin. The com is to be with, and the passion is difficulty or suffering. So at its root, it's the ability to be with difficulty or suffering. And we can think about that as difficulty or suffering externally, in our lives, the people that we care about. But what about with ourselves, in our own mind? is creating a bunch of suffering, when our own emotions are creating a bunch of suffering? And do we have the capacity, the skill, the strength, the stability to be able to be with that experience?
And most people can't.
And most people can't. And most people definitely don't have a way to train to be able to get better at that. They may think it's important. They would understand it's important. But what are you doing to train to get better at it? And that's what I fell in love with, man, was like, this is a training. This isn't just an interesting book or a set of ideas that we're talking about. This is a practice that we want to experience what it's like to have that stability and then work with the obstacles that get in the way of us experiencing that more often.
That's so good. So talk about I want to really dig in on how this novice, this rookie at mindfulness about meditation can get into this. I had a friend, John McCaskill, on, who's a former Navy SEAL, which you know, John, and he walked us through just a toe to head check-in, just real briefly, right? And I thought that was really good. I was thinking about there's other ways that we could do this, be it breath work.
Sure.
Or be it even walking and being alone with your thoughts with no other outputs, noises or headphones or whatever, which we typically do workouts with, right?
Sure.
Walk us through some of those that could get a novice moving. Yeah,
totally. So one of the ways I think it'd be really helpful to think about meditation and mindfulness training is we're giving the mind a job to do. And if we don't give the mind a job to do, it'll find a job to do. It'll wander off to the future. It'll think about the past. Some of it will be useful. Some of it will be helpful. But we just want to give it simple jobs to do. So mindfulness is really concerned with having attention be where we want it to be, in particular in the present moment. So the most effective ways to do that are pay attention to anchors that are happening in the moment. So one of them can be sensations in the body, like John's practice of kind of a body scan style practice of feeling sensations in the feet, legs, kind of working your way up. But it could be other sensations. So it could be, like you say, sensation of breathing. So I encourage, anybody listening, like right now, just, you don't have to do anything special, but just feel the breath that's moving in and out of your body.
Slightly different temperature going in versus out.
Yeah. And then where do we notice it? Maybe we notice it nose. Maybe we notice it throat. Maybe it's rise and fall of the chest or stomach. Doesn't really matter where we notice it. It's just happening in the present moment. But for some people, paying attention to internal anchors, that's what we would call these objects that we're giving our attention to, may not be helpful. So we can pay attention to external anchors. That could be sound. We're just aware of sounds that are arriving to the ears right now. We can do that as we're listening. We can do, like you say, like during a walk, during a workout, walking down the hallway. Or we could do it with a visual anchor. We just pick some object, let our attention steady on that object. And inevitably, what's going to happen is attention's going to wander off. And this is like the first major kind of myth that I want to bust about mindfulness is people get the idea that they're supposed to stop their minds from wandering. They're supposed to blank their minds. And that is impossible to do. The mind's going to produce thoughts. It's just what it does.
I think that is what most people think.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people, when they first do the practice, they're like, I'm bad at it because I can't stop my mind from thinking. And it's just an incorrect understanding of how the practice works. So we want to notice where our attention is. And this very much relates to what we would call meta-awareness, but it's just kind of George Mumford, who did this work with Phil Jackson and Jordan and Kobe and those teams, talks about it as the eye of the hurricane. We want to be aware of experience as it's happening without being swept into the storm. So with something like attention, I can notice, is my attention where I want it to be? Like right now, my attention, I want it to be with you in this conversation. But inevitably, something's going to come up where I'm going to think about what's coming later or what happened earlier, right? It's just what it does, right? No problem. Can I notice that? Choose to bring my attention back to where I want it to be. And that's a skill we can train. So I think about application of that. If we could know where our attention is, be able to redirect our attention more often, would that make us more effective professionals? Without a doubt.
Yeah.
More effective parents?
Without a doubt.
Partners? Yeah. Right? Not being swept up in our own emotional reactivity. Like the emotional reactivity is not a problem, but do we get swept away into it? So by training to pay attention to anchors, then we develop this meta awareness to know what's happening as it's happening. And that stability naturally starts to emerge. And the scientific literature is really clear that this is a reliable pattern on how this training starts to impact us.
That's incredible. So I had a thought about ADD in that as you're going through it. Because I'm ADD, I struggle with that all throughout school. You and I are about the same age, and it was not as big of a diagnosis back then. Yeah. And so I was not medicated all childhood and all And that was probably a good thing as well.
Yeah.
However, I did struggle in school. And in my ADD, the research that I've done is there's really two types. There's the hyperactivity and there's the noise sensitivity. And mine is more noise sensitive. Being that if we're in a college auditorium, albeit, and someone's chewing gum over here, and if my mind locks in on that, if I can hear that, that's all I can think about. And so there's where my distraction comes in.
Sure.
And so thinking about that, how would you recommend someone, and because we have a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to this show, as I told you, and a lot of entrepreneurs happen to be ADD.
Sure. Yep.
How would you guide them for mindfulness, and what would be some of the best practices?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this notion of, ADD, or even like mind wandering in general, right, it's not a problem. In fact, it can lead to creativity. It can lead to insights. It leads to new ideas. And that's why a lot of entrepreneurs probably, benefit from this, right? Is, something new sparks and they go follow it, right? So what we're doing with this practice is we're not shutting that down at all. We're just becoming aware of it as it's happening. And if it's beneficial, great, we go with it. If it's not beneficial, we start to ruminate about something that's not so helpful, we're aware of it, and then we can choose exactly to bring it back. And think about all the benefits of not wasting energy on unproductive thinking. I mean, we all have our loops that we get caught in. So if we can learn to name those loops, then we can tame those loops, and then we can redirect our attention to where it's going to be most effective. That's a game changer for both performance and productivity. So on like the application, right, of this is really cool study got published a number of years ago, and it's been replicated a bunch of times, where they find that people are mind wandering 47% of the time. Half of our waking day, we're not paying attention to what we're doing. And, we all know what that feels like, right? Whether we're reading a book, get to the end of the page, nothing. Right? Our eyes are doing the work. Our attention's somewhere else. Or in a conversation, same thing. It may drift off.
Then you have to reread the page because you're like, dang it.
Absolutely. But maybe you're reading that page and then some new idea sparks you. Oh, you know what? I could take that idea and it applies to my client over here that could allow us to do something new. So that can be effective, right? So, but this number, this 47%, we want to be able to increase that number to be able to pay attention where we want to pay attention in the moments that we do. So how do we do it? How do we train for it, right? Like one thing that I think is really important for everybody listening to know is that you don't have to do these practices while remaining still. Another huge misconception about this practice is we think we got to be, in a chair or a special position or something like that. Some people like doing the practices while being still, but we can do all of them while moving. So you can be walking, and maybe the anchor is sensations that are happening in the feet. So we're just feeling the feet walking, attention wanders off, we notice where it goes, and then we're able to bring it back if we want to be able to bring it back. The other thing, Josh, I think is really important with these practices, not only kind of like the foundational abilities to have attention where we want it to be, kind of have this eye of the hurricane more often, especially for high performers. And I'm very fortunate to spend, both athletics, I train with special forces team, train in corporate groups. High performers need to be able to metabolize the stress that they are experiencing. Because if they don't, the body is keeping the score.
Yes.
It's going to get stored in the body. And there's lots of ways that we can do this. Some of them are maladaptive, right? Like we can hit the sauce, right? And it seems to be effective in the short term, right? Whatever.
Well, it numbs, but it doesn't go away.
Sure, absolutely. Exercise, of course, is a really important way of doing this. But this is where mindfulness, the ability to be with our experience, is really important because, the stress comes up from the day, and then we can notice like, ooh, I got a little like worry in the chest, a little tightness, anxiety.
That's huge for entrepreneurs, including myself. Anxiety comes up a lot because we're focused on that future sense or that thing that might happen.
Yeah. And no problem.
Right.
Like that's part of the path, right? Like we don't want to shut that down, right? But anxiety can, if the thinking mind kind of starts to over perseverate on it, right? And it's thinking about it all the time, it can be a problem. But sometimes that anxiety just needs to be felt. Just needs to be acknowledged. We just feel that in the chest. Ooh. Right?
Is that where it is majority of the time? Because that's where I get mine.
I think for most people, it is in the chest. Some people like chest, shoulders are really common, right? For some people, like more in like the stomach, abdomen area. Yeah.
So we talked about the ADD piece, and we're recording this for Brain Health Awareness Month.
Yeah.
Why is this so important for those that have some brain health injuries or brain health I hate using the word disorder, right? So depression, anxiety, stuff of that nature. How can we effectively be proactive to utilize this to make sure that we're not having to go to medication if this can be a cause or
Sure.
a solution.
So I think, it's interesting you think about like brain health, and like that framing. We were talking a little bit the other day about this too, that I think it's important when we think about brain health that we think about it across the spectrum of maybe there's something challenging going on, right? Like maybe there is something like TBI, right? Or maybe there are, concussions that are happening, but all of us have brain health, right? Just like all of us have physical health. And at some point, physically we may need to see a professional, physician to help us work through something, but we all know we should be taking care of our physical bodies, but we tend not to have that same orientation around the mind. And that's the opportunity that we have to be able to train for this in some regular way. So what we want to do is we want to be able to find what's a system that I can put into place if I want the capacities of stability, resilience, embodied purpose, noticing the good, all these things that mindfulness and meditation offer. If I know those are going to be beneficial for me, then the question becomes, what are you doing to train for them? Because we know when we train for them, there's all sorts of positive benefits that come, including things like reduced perceived stress, right? World doesn't get less stressful. How we perceive it changes, right? Sleeping quality improves, relationship quality improves. So we have to kind of think through what's a training plan going to be that we can actually implement in our lives that's going to work for us.
So I was just thinking about, as you said that, I was thinking through the question of, is it because we can't see it that we don't treat it? But then I got going a little bit further with, well, if I have a severe stomach pain or I'm sick to my stomach, I typically do something about that, right? Or if we get a pain in our shoulder, we can't see that, but if it bugs us enough, we're going to go see an orthopedic person to figure out what that pain is to take care of it. What is it about us as humans that we don't take care of our brain when we have a pain going on? Can we not recognize it, or what is it? Or do we attribute it to something else? I'm trying to figure that out as I talk through that.
It's a great question. Probably all those things are at play. It also makes me wonder do we just start to slowly get used to it? Oh, this is our new normal. Right? Of feeling distracted, of feeling this low grade sense of.
But would we do that with our stomach or our shoulder? Or?
I think, and sometimes we do, right? And that's where chronic injuries show up, right? And until it flares, until it hurts bad enough, then we don't do something about it, right? And so the opportunity is, well, what if we didn't wait so long, right? What if we did something earlier in the process, whether it's, physical awareness or mental, emotional awareness? And that, I think, is kind of like the exciting opportunities to have that awareness earlier in the process. So I think this also relates to some of the other, maybe to tie it to some of the research and what we're seeing here and some of the findings. So we just had this study published over the winter. This comes from Badger Volleyball, so one of our higher performing teams at Wisconsin. And what we see here is on the same day that the athletes did a mindfulness practice, they had statistically significant improvements in mood, energy level, muscle readiness, readiness to train. Same day, they had those impacts. And the next day, they had a reduction in the incidence of injury by 58%.
So that's when you told me this study, that was awesome, because it wasn't just up here. It was an actual physical thing as well.
Totally. And this is, Josh, where it gets really interesting, because meditation takes as its starting place that the mind and body is one system. It would never treat them as something separate. Yet oftentimes in our culture, we do treat them as somehow separate, right? But they're not. And so do we want those kind of benefits of resilience, of more energy, of kind of I would say, the muscle readiness to train, I'm sure I know you and I are active people, the listenership are active, but also just kind of our readiness to get after it, whatever that is. And we know during periods of stress, those things tend to go down. So this is showing us that this is a reliable way to tick those foundational performance factors up, including that number, that 58% reduction in incidence of injury the following day, man. I mean, that's the sort of number that changes the way that sport is trained forever. It's the sort of number that changes the way that any high performer trains forever. Because if they're offline, they're not going to be able to accomplish what it is that they want to accomplish. And it starts to show that by treating the mind and body as this one system and respecting that we need to be able to compost that stress, metabolize that stress, give ourselves that foundational awareness, we're moving in the direction of being able to say, if folks aren't finding a way to integrate this training, they're leaving gains on the table.
Yeah.
So let's not do that. We have to find a way to integrate this training, and it can be small, right? We're talking minutes a day, right? It costs nothing.
I was just thinking that you may have grabbed an athlete's attention or an entrepreneur's attention right there with that 58% number of injury going down, let alone all the brain health effects that are positive effects that are going to have. And they're like, all right, Josh, ask Chad next. What do I do?
Yeah.
Okay. So what is it that you're doing with the Badger volleyball women, which for those that don't know, got them to a national championship, not just but actually won it. And then they've been back to the Final Four at least a couple times since, and the Badger football team and others. So what are you teaching them to do that someone from this, listening to this or watching this could go, okay, I'm in.
Yep, absolutely. So there's so much fun stuff to explore on the how do we implement it side of things. So, but some really easy, actionable ones is, we've all probably heard the line, be where your feet are. So we can just turn that into a training. So like right now we can feel the sensations that are happening in the feet, feel the tingling, feel the pulsating, let attention settle there. Wanders off, no problem. Come back. That's it. Move on with your day. So imagine implementing that throughout the day, in between meetings, before a difficult conversation, after a call with a client. And that's an example of, to use what happened and how it showed up with Badger volleyball in that national championship run. They were playing Nebraska, go to 5 sets, our arch rival. Thought we'd won the national championship. Stormed the floor, right? Hugging, the whole thing. Nebraska coach challenges the call. So our players come to the sideline, confusion, ambiguity, worry. And they talked about in that moment, doing a practice like that, feeling their feet on the floor, feeling the breath roll in, breath roll out, tracking racing thoughts and emotions, letting them settle. So that when they return to the court, they return with stability, presence, readiness, and then won that second national championship point, bringing home the first national championship in program history. Now, they didn't win it because of mindfulness and meditation. They won it because of thousands of hours of dedication and hard work. So I think that's an interesting thing when we think about applying this in other environments. Like the folks listening to this podcast, they're expert. They're best in class. They know how to do the work in their field. All this training is doing is giving them a reliable way to train their mind to be stable, present, work with obstacles so that they can unleash that capacity moment after moment after moment. And of course, the compounding benefits of that are going to be massive for performance and well-being. So we want to find easy ways to do it, right? So it could be something like the be where your feet are, right? Or like the practice John did, like body scan style practice, or practice I love is mindful walking. So everybody listening could just pick a path that they walk every day. Maybe it's the path from, the bedroom to the kitchen, right? Or maybe it's a hallway that they go down every day. Well, what if when they went down that hallway, they just gave their mind the opportunity to pay attention to an anchor that's happening in the present moment during that walk? Maybe they're just checking with their shoulders. A lot of us tend to carry around a ton of tension in our shoulders. Checking with the jaw, right? Checking with the breath. Just let things settle a little bit. Mind wandering happens, no problem, come back. So that by the time you show up to whatever's at the end of that hallway, there's a little more freshness, a little more presence, a little more ability to be stable. I also want to be really clear, the benefits of this practice, just like physical training, and we think about this work as strength and conditioning for the mind, the benefits come from training repeatedly.
Yeah.
You don't just go to the gym once and say, sweet, I'm good for the year, right? You don't have to do 70.
Wouldn't that be nice?
You don't have to do 75 hard either, right? Some of us might want to do that.
66 over here, 67, whatever I'm at.
But whatever our training rhythm is physically, we know we have to do it repeatedly to get the benefits of it. So we need to think about the mind in the same way. It's kind of those compounding benefits, over weeks where we start to see significant change.
So you're also the scientist. One of them, Dr. Richie Davidson, you got Borland over there and many other brilliant minds. Why does it work?
Yeah, this is fascinating, man. Like there's some really cool science that's coming out around the why, right? So one is, the simple scientific truth of neuroplasticity. So this is the idea that the brain is constantly being trained. We used to think that maybe it was by the time you got to 20, 25, the brain was sort of done developing. And modern science has proven that's just not true. The brain is developing throughout the lifespan. Every single moment, the brain is being trained. So the question is, who's in charge of that process? Do we just allow circumstance to dictate the qualities they're being trained in our brains? Or do we take responsibility and train for the qualities that we know are going to be important for performance and well-being? When we take responsibility for it, like we do with mindfulness and meditation training, that's when we think about it as strength and conditioning for the mind. So neuroplasticity is that foundation. And there's really cool findings, including things like we see increased activity in regions of the brain that are related to things like attention, emotion regulation, prosociality, how we relate to others. We actually see more activity in those brain regions when folks are meditating, or we even see telomeres. So this is deep end nerd stuff for us here, right? For a moment, So
I like nerd shit on the brain though.
So
that's where I can nerd out.
It's really, I mean, it's unbelievable stuff. So telomeres are kind of like the end of genes. And we actually see the telomere size grow when folks are engaged in meditation training. So at the genetic level, we're seeing structural changes as folks are engaged in this training.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's like the one area of science where I can nerd out, where I can set my jock self aside. And
Well, and this is where it's really interesting, right? Because they think about like working out, right? You know, like working out is great, right? And one of the things that's fun about working out is you're like, all right, I put this much on the squat rack last week. You know, my goal is up here. So this is my training plan to be able to get there. And we can see it, right? Like we can lift more now, or mobility is more speed.
And over time, you can see it in the mirror.
And over time, you see it in the mirror, right? Whereas with our internal life, it can be a little trickier to see those things. Yet we know it in ourselves, right? Oh, I'm just sleeping a little bit better, right? I'm a little bit more relaxed, right? But where we tend to see it most is not kind of from our own first person experience, but from the people around us. They're able to notice it. So there's a classic story from one of my friends who does this work, you know, and this guy took his class, 8-week mindfulness class. And after the class, you know, went and told his family like, hey, you know, I did the class. It was interesting, but you know, I'll do something else now. And, you know, his wife and kids are like, you cannot stop. You've been so much more easy to be around. So
that's
much more
where
pleasant.
I think people can see it, right? Is like, so I was thinking about the physicality of looking in the mirror, and you can, you're always the last person to see it, right?
Yep.
So your spouse, your friends will be like, oh my gosh, Chad, you've lost weight. You look so good.
Yep.
You know, you got more muscle on you, whatever. And you're like, and you're kind of like,
do I
do it?
Yeah.
Do I? Oh, thank you. But do I? Like, you're always the last person to see it. So I was thinking about that with the brain health side of things. Is that's where you'd see it. Someone would be like, you know, you're different.
Yeah, totally. You're just a little bit calmer, right? You're a little bit more productive, right? You know, like you're a little more efficient than you used to be, right? The adversity doesn't take you down quite as long as it used to be.
You don't have a snap reaction of anger or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. All those things start to change, which that's an interesting way to notice change in ourselves. But I would also add that should be part of our motivation to practice is yes, as an individual, we want to get better, right? We want to get better professionally. We want to get better personally. But who benefits when each of us individually get better? It's the people around us. It's our partner, right? It's our kids. It's our community. It's our colleagues. It's our collaborators. So when we think about, all right, this week, I'm going to take 3 minutes every morning as my coffee's getting ready, you just sit in the chair, get present with my body, track what's happening, steady attention. And all day long, everybody who I interact with is going to be positively impacted by those 3 minutes that I took. So it's not selfish at all.
Right.
It's extremely
Selfless.
compassionate, benevolent, selfless, without a doubt.
I was just thinking about that as well as like, you know, lower back stuff is a pain for me as I played many years of football. And typically I don't go to the chiro until it hurts, right?
Yeah.
However, if I was practicing more mindfulness body scan check-ins, I could be more aware of before it's too big of a pain and I got to go schedule an appointment that might be a week out or something of that nature.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's, you know, that number, that 58% number of reduction of incidence and injury, I think part of it has to do exactly with this, right? Is if we're aware of what's happening in our body. So scientifically, we would call that interoception, knowing what's happening in our body as it's happening. Then that's data, that's information. And that data information allows us to make different choices. Maybe it's, you know, I'm going to do a little bit more foam roller today, or maybe I don't put that extra plate on today because, you know, whatever, things just don't feel great or whatever. Or maybe I, you know, hit up the PT a little bit earlier in the process to get ahead of this. But if we don't have an ability to get that information about what's going on in our body, or that information to get about what's going on in our minds, then we have no chance to make an informed decision. So that is another way we can think about these practices. It's basically just like data collection. It's getting an accurate picture of what's happening in your own mind and body, and then being able to work with whatever's coming up.
So I hope everyone's capturing this because my mind's going to like peak performance right now with how you're describing this. And because you're working with not only peak performers, but peak coaches. Like for those that don't know Coach Sheffield, dude is an incredible leader. And because he's a women's volleyball is not as high profile as say Coach Fickle on the UW football team, or college football brings in the most revenue to all the schools, right? But Coach Sheffield's amazing as a leader. And I'm just thinking about this peak performance and the players that you're working with, the coaches you're working with. let's say you don't feel like you do that check-in and you got a big performance, a big meeting, national championship game, or you got this close that you're about to walk into for a sale is, it could be life-changing or at least year-changing for your business, but you don't feel right. How do we get to peak performance then?
So a couple things. So one, we cannot let our kind of how we feel in the moment, if it's not at peak performance, to get in the way of us allowing to perform the best we can in that moment.
Yeah.
Right. Like Kelly
still
Sheffield,
gotta perform.
You still got to perform. Right. And this is where, maybe you're best in that moment, walking into, close that sale or, perform in that, national championship match. Maybe your absolute best in that moment is 85%. Great. Well, let's go give 85%, man. Yeah. And what we shouldn't do is be in that 85% thinking about like, oh, wish I had this other 15%. What can I do to get it? Right. That's just like distracting from what we can be bringing to that moment. So when it's go time, we got to be able to go, right? I think about it this way. So this was language I learned from a SWAT team leader that I had the opportunity to train with his team. And he talked about, as a SWAT team, they go into high intensity, no fail, lethal environments.
Yeah, they can't be thinking about the other 15%.
No, because they're expected to bat 1,000.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Because it's life or death.
It's life or death, right? And like nobody gives a flying hoot, right?
Yeah.
Like to PG the language, how the SWAT operator's feeling that morning.
Yeah.
When you're going in, right?
You gotta go perform.
Like you gotta go perform, right? So when they finish that operation and they come out, he doesn't want the suit to come up to him and say, good job. He wants to hear, thank you for being consistent. Thank you for being consistent in your training, because being consistent is hard. Mm-hmm. So that consistent in training in a SWAT, community or in an athletic community, that definitely means physical, right? They have to physically be able to do what they need to do. It's technical, it's tactical, it's all of those things are in place. But he added, what am I doing to train my mind to be able to consistently show up and perform in those moments? So I think all of us can think about it in that same way. It's unrealistic to think that we're going to be at 100% every day. It's just not how humans work. I mean, great on the days when we get our 100%. But if all we got is 50% today, well, how am I going to maximize my 50% while also bringing, a sense of kindness, a sense of compassion, and not beating ourselves up for being at 50% that day?
Just last night, I was dragging ass through a workout.
Yeah.
It's my second workout of the day. I'd only gotten 5 hours of sleep just because of how this week I was telling you how it's gone, and got my first workout in. And then I was on mentally from 7:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. No break.
Yeah.
And so I go into that workout and I'm just dragging ass. And my trainer's like, you good today? I was like, I'm getting through this one.
Yeah.
Like,
totally.
I'm not at 100%.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, you're still doing good. And he's encouraging or whatever. But like, it's just like that mentally or physically. You got to show up and be consistent and give your best no matter what percentage you're at, and get through what you got to get through. 75 hard is a great, I would say, a great trainer of consistency.
Sure.
Because you got 75 days to do 2 workouts a day, gallon of water a day, your 10 pages of nonfiction reading per day, all the different tasks. What a lot of people don't realize is that it's part of the Live Hard program. And I don't even know if you know this either. So there's 3 other phases of the Live Hard program. Phase 1 is another 30 days after 75 days. And as a part of it is actually a 10-minute visualization.
Oh, cool.
So you have to do all the normal 75 hard tasks. You got to do a 5-minute cold shower and 10-minute visualization. And then there's one other item I'm not recalling off the top of my head. But the 10-minute visualization could be part of this work.
Yeah. So I would imagine, the future, right?
Yeah.
As we start to think about like what's possible with this work is, I think this work, since it's foundational to every single moment of our lives, attention, ability to be stable, ability to be resilient. There's no moment of our life where that's not important. So the future of this work is integrating this training so that it's just a normal part of how we train every day. So it, and I'm not arguing with whoever created 75 hard, right? And like whatever these 3 phases are, right? But that should be a part of phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. It should be a part of every single part of how we train throughout our life.
Because it's that effective in helping us to achieve or perform at all those other things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's very, and I guess one of the arguments you could make is that one of the key areas that I do a lot of visualization, thought work, prayer, meditation, or body check-in is on my outdoor rucks, which are 45 minutes as well at minimum. So I guess that could be one argument there, is that it's in there. What's fascinating as well, I've noticed, I don't see the chiropractor near as much when I'm on 75 hard.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that's more movement.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
Than anything.
Yeah. So I think too, Josh, this is an interesting thing, right? Where people can get the wrong idea that the mindfulness and meditation training is something else they have to add. It's not. Maybe somebody does want to take 2 minutes, when they're making their coffee, or take 10 minutes to do a body scan. But you can easily include it in something like, the 45-minute ruck. Or whatever it is, right? Meditation has nothing to do with the breath. It has nothing to do with relaxing. It has everything to do with putting your attention where you want it to be. And so you can do that during any activity. So we just have to be intentional about that. How am I going to train my attention during an activity that I normally already do? Could be something like exercise, or it could be something like folding clothes, doing the dishes. It's some low cognitive load activity where we can train attention, train in mindfulness.
How old's your son now?
He's 8.
8. How are you teaching him?
Yeah. So this has been a really fun thing to consider. So I took the approach of I can point out things on how this works, and then eventually he'll do more practice. So quick story on how this showed up. So this is years ago, right? He's like 3 or 4 or something. He was in the back seat, we're going wherever we're going. And he says, Dada, which even that, right? Heart, you feel Dada, right? Dada, I just had a thought in my mind. And I think, oh, interesting, right? I try not to get too excited. What was the thought? And it was about, something that, was happened at school that day. Okay. And then what happened? And he said, and then I, could feel like my stomach was upset, so it was a little challenging, right? Okay. Now what do you feel? Oh, I feel good. I feel happy. Right. All right. And then we just kind of like moved on. Right. So I think that ability, recognize a thought as it's happening, recognize an emotion as it's happening, give them space, acknowledge them. And then what do they oftentimes do? They just move on, right? We don't need to make a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah.
And so more recent example is soccer, right? So he's playing youth soccer. So he gave up an own goal recently, right? Bummer, right?
Yeah.
Mistakes happen.
Yeah.
So he said, Dad, did you see me after, what happened after I gave up the own goal? And I was like, yeah, I saw you on the sideline sort of thing. And he's like, I was on the sideline and I felt really sad and actually cried. And I was like, okay, no problem. That's a normal response, right? Tough situation. And then he said, and then I meditated. I was like, oh, cool. Like, what'd you do? Right. And he said, well, I noticed my shoulders, were really tight. So I just kind of like relaxed and I just kind of felt them. And I just like felt, I could feel the sadness. I could feel the tears. And then I looked back to the field and I noticed what was going on in the game. And I got excited to go back into the game. So like, that's resilience, man.
Yeah.
Like right there. Because you or I, anybody listening, we're going to experience difficulty today. I guarantee it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is, right? So the question isn't how do we get rid of that? The question is how do we bounce back from it more quickly? And denying it, suppressing it, avoiding it are terrible strategies, especially in the long run. We have to find a way to acknowledge it, be with it, experience it with stability so that next moment when we show up, when that next client shows up, when our kid wants to hang out with us, when we have a cool opportunity to hang out with a friend and do a podcast, are we fully there for it?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing you did there that I want everyone to recognize is you asked questions. You didn't affirm immediately. And this is what great parents do. And I think that a lot of parents need to learn this is like, it's very easy. And you think it's good to be like, hey, good job.
Yeah, right.
Good job, buddy. I'm proud of you.
Yeah.
And what you did was you were trying to get him to articulate how he felt about it, not how you felt about it. And that's so powerful. And I just want any parent listening to grasp what you did there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great noticing. I mean, I think about that all the time, whatever position we're in, like whether it's, parent, or even as a friend, right? Or leader for sure is like, it's that curiosity, right? It's that, oh, tell me more about what's going on there. Like our job is not to give them answers, right? Whether they're folks that, like we get to be in a leader in an organization of, or kids, whoever it is, our job is to help them figure out the way to their own answers. And that's what effective leadership is. That's what effective teaching is. So how do we do that in a way that allows those insights to be stable for them? Because if it's clear for us, well, who cares?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's got to be clear for them.
It's got to be clear for them. Absolutely. So I'm just thinking about this with my own kids too, because there's certain things in life that are nature and nurture, and confidence is one of those. My second born come out of the womb with a insane amount of confidence.
Yeah.
Now that, you can also nurture confidence.
Yep.
My third born, quite a bit of anxiety. And I've been, because what I know best is breath work, because that's what I've done best at, and calming myself through that. My default emotion is more anger. She spirals a little bit more with anxiety. So I've been trying to get her to breathe through it. But thinking through some more exercises for parents, is there anything to equip our kids better growing up to be more mindful? How would you go about telling parents what exercise or what simple things can they do besides the question asking that we just talked about?
Sure. Yeah. So I think from a parenting perspective, and I think this could very quickly apply to a leadership perspective too, right? Like anybody who
Well, good parents and good leadership is very, very similar.
there's a whole lot going on there, right? Your nervous system is doing the training. So pay attention to what's going on in you.
That's powerful. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So a kid comes to us, right? And is our nervous system immediately judgmental, reactive, trying to take authority? Well, that's what's being taught, right? Or do we actually have a sense of curiosity? Do we actually embody a sense of care? Something very different is being taught. And so I would encourage anybody, parent, leader, make sure that you're not just talking about the importance of this for yourself and, in a parent role, a leadership role, but you're actually practicing yourself. And we actually see this in some of the science, especially in education. When we train teachers up in this style of practice, we see impacts in their kids, in their students, even when the teachers don't teach them anything about the practice, because it's just how they show up. It's how that teacher is. Thus, it's impacting their kids in the classroom. So I just stay here, stay with old number one. And we tend to skip over that all the time in any helping profession, if you will, right? Whether it's parenting, I don't mean to say parenting as a profession, right? But thinking about like where we show.
But it is a job.
It's it's the most important job, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's parenting or leadership, healthcare, education, law enforcement, we skip over the person who is providing for the person they're providing it for. And that's short-sighted and it's going to lose impact. We got to stay here for a while. And then of course there are strategies to be able to, work developmentally appropriately with kids, with 4, 5, 6, 10-year-olds, right? But I think we'd get a lot more bang for our buck if we stayed at the old number one level for a while.
It's putting that oxygen on yourself.
Yes.
Before assisting others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's so good because people need to hear that.
Yeah. And then we need to, and then it's again and again and again. Like we know, one of the best predictors of kids' activity levels as adults was their parents' activity levels when they were kids. It's just the modeling, right? So if, mom and dad or whoever's in the home, right? If they're walking around flying off the handle all the time, well, what's going to get taught, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's how we solve problems, is we fly off the handle, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if mom and dad, they see like, all right, they've got ways of kind of like working with their stress and acknowledging what's going on, then that's what's going to be taught to the kids as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. All right. So how can the Spartan community contribute further to this mission for either you or the world as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for anybody who's hearing this, especially if you're new to practice, right, is you want to be able to find other people to practice with. These practices were meant to be done in community. We can obviously have the role of doing it. We need that time to be able to do it by ourselves. But whether it's connecting with friends to have these conversations or connecting with somebody who's in a more kind of guide, teacher sort of role, finding others to practice with. So this becomes a normal part of how we operate. One of the cool things we see in sport is that community is natural. It's the team. So we just do it together as a team.
Yeah.
So what's the team that exists for you, right? And again, they could be family, professionally. Maybe it's working with somebody, a coach, right? Like myself. But find those people that can help you make this a normal part of how you live your life.
Oh, that's really good. I was just thinking about this. So I wear this Whoop band, and some people may wear an Aura ring, but HRV becomes a heart rate variability that becomes a normal part of your speak with the Whoop band or the Oura Ring.
Yeah.
And some of the measurements that I get. Is there any technology that's coming our way for brain regularity and being able to monitor?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm also a Whoop band guy, right? And it can be really, beneficial and really interesting. They can also cause us problems, right? If we start to lean toward optimization of what the data are telling us from this device rather than the data that we're picking up from our own firsthand experience. We need both of those things.
A hyper competitive person gets in there. And
my Whoop band told me I'm only 47% recovered today, right? And I did XYZ, right? And it's like, well, who knows, right? They're not perfect instruments and it's just part of the picture. In terms of data from kind of like a brain health perspective, we're early days, man. So our best are to use like physical proxies like Whoop, Aura, those sorts of things. And we do see impacts there. We do see like HRV get impacted positively, resting heart rate get impacted positively in these sorts of things. But we kind of have to take a long view approach. It wouldn't be like, I did my meditation today. What was my overnight HRV? It's not going to be that quick, right? We need to look at trends over time. But I would encourage folks to rely less on those data and rely more on their kind of first person experience of how it's showing up and benefiting them, or that second person experience like we were talking about earlier of like, what are your friends, family, close colleagues noticing about how things are going for you?
I don't have the exact number of years, you might, but the reason you're saying that we're so early days is because So I was talking to Niraj about this, and the fMRI and being able to scan our brains really only happened about 3 decades ago.
Totally.
Right. So the rest of our body and maybe our heart and the way our vascular system is and stuff like that was more like 80 years ago that we could start monitoring that a little bit better. Obviously, technology's advanced on both cases, but think about that percentage of time. Like that's why we're so early days on the brain science.
Absolutely. Like we're just uncovering things. So even like a really cool finding that came out of like these early days of, fMRIs, putting people in the brain scanners. And again, this is like a finding that's maybe 15 years old, right? So like brand new basically in terms of science is they had people in the fMRI and they noticed before they even started the experiment, certain brain regions ticked online reliably across people when they were kind of doing nothing. Right? When they're just kind of like sitting there waiting. So they just started to notice this pattern emerged. And so then they did experiments to try to see, they would give kind of sham experiments to say we're about to do the experiment and then just watch people's activity before it began. In these zones, these regions of the brain that ticked online, they named the default mode network. And it's what the regions of the brain that kick in the default mode. It's kind of just the baseline that they return to. And the default mode regions are closely connected with self-referential thinking. So to me, that's unbelievably insightful.
Yeah.
Like we're sitting around, we're kind of doing whatever we're doing, right? And who do we tend to think about? Well, number one.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're the stars of the movie.
Yeah.
Right?
In either a good way or a bad way.
For sure. And some of that can be good, right? We want to take care of ourselves, right? We want to know what we're doing. We want to improve, right? I'm not like anti-thinking about ourselves. Like that's a good thing, but that can really easily turn into rumination. Right?
Yeah. And
that
can spiral downwards.
Absolutely. And so not only is that like, going to be challenging for performance, but think about like our relationships, right? Yeah. And like our long-term happiness. We feel really good when we're connected with others. That sense of compassion, that sense of genuine altruism, is a really supportive pro-social quality. So I think those insights that we're just beginning to tap into from a neuroscientific perspective are hopeful, are exciting, are really good. And we're just going to continue to get way more insights, as you say, as the science continues to grow over these next 5, 10, 20 years.
So the studies that I've read say we have about 60,000 thoughts per day on average.
Sure. And
that number could be slightly higher, slightly lower, depending on the person, but that's the average that I've seen. But about 90% of them are recurring, right? So how can we take this work and make sure that we are either increasing our new thought or making sure we replace some negative thought with productive thought? Yeah.
So I think this is one of the huge gifts of mindfulness and meditation training. So the scientific word we call this is decentering or de-reification. And all that means is the ability to observe thoughts as passing phenomena.
I see it as clouds in the sky.
Love
right?
it.
So you have 60,000 thoughts. You don't have control of those thoughts as they come to your mind. They're passing through. But you do have control over what you attach to, correct?
Yep, totally. And so one of the things we can do for those repetitive thoughts, and we all have them, right? Whatever the number is, right? Or in our own experience, they're kind of the stories we tend to tell ourselves. So one of the things we can do is a strategy called name it to tame it. So you give those stories, those repetitive thoughts, a name. Oh, this is the whatever, woe is me, right? This is this person always does that, right? This is the whatever those repetitive thoughts are. And then we just name it, oh, that's happening again. And then we have that space. We got that mindfulness, that meta-awareness, eye of the hurricane. Is it accurate? Is it true? And if it's not, no problem. It can cruise on by. But we have to train for that ability to be able to do that. And anybody who sits down, if we were to do, a 3-minute practice, people would start to notice all sorts of stories coming through their mind, right? Stories about themselves, stories about their day, stories about problems, stories about opportunities. And we start to notice those stories as they're happening and then give ourselves the space to choose. Is this helpful? Is it accurate? Is it not? But if we're not training to be able to do that, then we're going to have no chance of doing it kind of in the heat of the moment.
So we talked about Chris Borland earlier. You brought it up briefly. For those that don't know Chris, he was a Badger football player, played in the NFL for 1 year only. And he replaced Patrick Willis, one of the all-time San Francisco great linebackers. And as a rookie, just had an incredible year. And then almost explicitly, like just retires for his own accord and his own brain health. But then comes to work where you work and is now, leading the charge in this. And I'm just thinking through that scenario, how you guys work with people with TBI, PTSD, all the different things. How can the mindfulness work? Let's say someone has struggled or had a PTSD event or had numerous concussions or whatever it may be. Yeah. How have you seen this work really affect them in a positive manner?
Yeah, I think so one of the things, and Chris has shared this publicly, but when he retired from the league and was looking to do something to support, one of the things that when he came to the Center for Healthy Minds research group on campus, Richie Davidson, our founder, said to him that the structural impacts on the brain we may not be able to change, but what we can work with are the symptoms that are produced as a result. So I think first we need to have a certain sense of let's be real about what's happening, and not try to snake oil salesman, positive benefits that may or may not be able to come, right?
Right. So so TBI and PTSD, we should separate in that instance then, right?
Sure.
Because TBI, like there's either massive concussion or an accident or in the military versus PTSD is having an experience.
I think it's really important distinction there, right? So TBI, right, has to do with there's something structurally that's been impacted in the brain, right? Just something structurally may have impacted in another part of the body, right? Like that's there. PTSD is as it's some differences. On the PTSD note, interestingly enough, some of the research that we've published coming out of our work in law enforcement, where PTSD is very prevalent, is we see a reduction in hypervigilance, hyperarousal, and re-experiencing after 8 weeks of training. And it's really important to note that the officers who are part of these studies weren't recruited because of symptoms of PTSD. They were just a general sample of officers. And this, of course, PTSD is present in a sample of officers and beyond officers. There's estimates from a colleague at UW, Claudia Reardon, that 30% of the US population has clinical levels of PTSD. So it's a lot more common than we think. But by integrating this sort of training, we can see reductions in those clinical levels. And if we think about it, Josh, from mindfulness in particular is really concerned with what's happening in this moment.
Yeah.
Something at a simplified level, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, that's the mind preparing for something that isn't happening right now, that may happen in the future, but experiencing as if it were happening right now.
Yeah.
Re-experiencing is the other end, right? Something that happened in the past, but experiencing it as if it were happening right now. Yeah. So it's being able to discern, my mind, my emotions, my body is going into that state of living it out as if it were happening right now, and then being able to be aware of that. separate from that, have some space from that, and choose to put your attention somewhere else. So that's where this work can become really, really important. Caveat here is, I'm not a mental health provider. We want to be able to give folks the support that they need. And a lot of mental health providers are including this work. But I think it's really exciting that when we bring this work into general populations, we see reductions in clinical levels of things like PTSD symptoms. And that should be highly, highly motivating for the regular integration of this training. For sure. 30%. Isn't that wild? So I think, something like PTSD, I think a lot of times we think about it as limited to just kind of an acute moment, whether that's, military, police, or other, suicide, like those big moments. And those are important, right? We need to recognize those and have resources and systems in place to be able to support folks. But there's a lot of evidence that it's just kind of the low grade stressors over time, again and again and again, accumulate, compound, and can result in these clinical levels, which we as a culture in general just tend to deny the importance of those low grade stressors again and again and again at our own peril for performance and well-being. The body keeps score. The body keeps the score. Which is also, was that Pete Agascu that wrote that book, or who wrote that book? That is Bessel van der Kolk wrote that book. Yeah, The Body Keeps Score. Yeah. Which is fascinating, and everyone should at least have an understanding of that, whether or not they get to dig into the research or not. But yeah, it is true, and that's why we got to deal with our. Well, and honestly, man, I think this is where it comes down to, we're just navigating what does it mean to be a human being. Yeah. We're all living this human experience. So we're just figuring out how to do that a little more effectively, right? What does it mean to have a body like this? What's it mean to have a mind? What's it mean to have these emotions, be in relationship with people? A soul. Yeah. And how do we navigate that? And I think the beauty of the field that I work in, of mindfulness and meditation, is, for 2,500 years, people have been investigating using these techniques to navigate what does it mean to be a human being. Modern science showed up about 30, 40 years ago and said, well, let's use these tools to investigate the experience. But we're part of a long lineage of people that have been exploring how do we navigate this human experience for my own well-being and for the well-being of those around me. So while there's a lot of new science that's confirming, we're resting on, thousands of years of wisdom. I love it. All right, last question. I had changed it for this month. I usually ask an unpopular belief. Yeah. So I changed it for this month, being in the spirit of brain health. Yeah. So what is a commonly held misconception about brain health, mental health, however we want to frame it, that you wish could be permanently dispelled? That in order to be happy, things have to be different than they are. What if we could find a way to feel a sense of okayness, a sense of balance, regardless of the circumstances that were happening in our lives? And I don't say that to deny, if there's structural things that need to change, right? In our community, legal systems, and, there's a lot of things that need to be different that perpetuate suffering. But in our own minds and our own bodies, we have the capacity to feel a sense of okayness every single moment. But we have to be able to train the mind to do that. And when we do that, not only do we feel better in the moment, are we going to be better in the moment, but I would argue that puts us in a much more powerful position to tackle the thorny, difficult, complex challenges that our world is facing. Yeah, that's good. That really roots out, playing the victim, which has become popular nowadays. People can get trapped in that identity because they receive attention from it, but they're not really okay. Yeah. Totally. So how do we cultivate that, daily? What's a practice to be able to feel that? And then what would happen if we did that in community? There's an amazing quote from a meditation teacher that is, you're perfectly okay exactly as you are, and you can get better. And in our culture, we are so good at the "and you can get better" part, especially, in this community, we are 10 out of 10s on the "and you can get better" part. Which is good, right? We want to get better. But what would happen if we did a little bit of both? How would that impact our performance? How would that impact our well-being? How would that impact our long-term sustainability? I think it would have tremendous positive impact. Well, that's just not a meditation teaching. That's a biblical teaching. Yeah, for sure. So it doesn't matter what side of the coin you're on, it's taught both ways. Yeah. And this is like the deep humanity of it, right? Like maybe we use different words or different traditions use different metaphors but we can't get, kind of caught looking at the finger that's pointing at the moon, right? Like it's the experience that we're after. So we have so much to learn from so many different traditions.
Yeah, so much. Well, we are out of time. I do want to thank you for bringing your big brain and big heart to the studio today. It's always a pleasure to have conversations with you. So, Brother Chad, where can they follow you? Where can they find you if they want to work with you? How can they follow along on your journey?
Sure. So to follow, the best places to go is inneredgemeditation.com. That gives descriptions of the work that we're doing, ways to connect on social or, work together, coming into an organization. And happy to continue the conversation because I think this population, the folks listening to this podcast, and I'm just saying it to gas folks up, right? But are trendsetters, right? Are change makers, are leaders that can make a difference in how we operate. And so to be able to support folks to bring this style of training into their environments, into their lives, I'm convinced it's going to have rippling beneficial effects, across our communities and our nation.
Agreed. Entrepreneurs are the change. Any social media?
Social media, yep. Basically like at Chad McGehee on all channels.
All right. Spartans, you know what to do with this. You learned a lot today from Chad in this conversation. So please share it far and wide. His work is so important. And as we close out our brain health awareness campaign this month, just want you to focus on the present, as Chad talked about today. Think about your presence, how you're showing up to the world, how you can show up for yourself first and foremost, and make sure that you make it through today. Not only make it through, but can thrive to the best of your ability. Whether you're at 85%, like we talked about earlier, or at 100%, that you can get through it and that you belong here, as we all do. And so with that being said, Spartans, remember that good and great are the enemies of possible. Lead like a Spartan can.